All right, hello everybody. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. My name is Sarah Bowman, and I am the Natural Resource Specialist with the Gallatin Conservation District. Our main presenter today is Monica Pokorny, and she is a plant material specialist with the NRCS Bridger Plant Materials Center. Before we officially get started, I would just like to remind everyone that we are recording this presentation for future viewing. So if you could please keep yourself muted and your video off during the presentation. You'll be able to unmute yourself and turn your video back on for questions at the end. And please save any questions you may have until the end of the presentation. You can either type your questions into the comment box, or you can use your raise your hand feature at the end, and then I will call on folks for questions. So with that, let's get started. All right, so, oh, why are you not going? Oh, there we go. All right, so the purpose of this presentation today is to promote our new program, the Gallatin Pollinator Initiative. And to do this, Monica will be presenting about the importance of pollinators, and we'll go over some basics for creating beneficial pollinator habitat. And then we'll go into details for how the Pollinator Initiative program is run and how any Gallatin County landowner can participate. So the whole purpose of the Gallatin Pollinator Initiative is to increase the amount of beneficial pollinator habitat in Gallatin County. This program provides free pollinator seed mix for any landowner to create their own pollinator plots, and we're focusing mostly on smaller acreage landowners. This program is growing statewide, with it starting in northwestern Montana in Lake County with the Lake County Conservation District in 2016. Since then, the conservation districts throughout the state have been starting up their own similar programs, so we're excited to have it here in Gallatin County now as well. The reason why we want to create more pollinator habitat is because pollinator insects, animals, all the pollinators are so important to our ecosystem, our food production, our economy, and more. So I'll hand off the presentation to Monica now, and she'll go into more details about why these pollinators are so important and discuss basics for creating the best pollinator habitat possible.
Great, thanks, Sarah, and good morning, everyone. Hopefully you can hear me okay. And I'm going to go ahead and turn off my video for the presentation. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm a plant person, but I want to start out today talking about the importance of pollinator insects as a basis for why we're interested in creating pollinator habitat. So because plants can't move, they have to rely on animals or wind to transfer their pollen, which is the male part of the flower, to the female part of the flower in a process called pollination. And as a result, a plant that is fertilized through pollination then can produce a seed or a fruit. And more than 85% of flowering plants require an animal, which is mostly insects, to move pollen. And the result then is that we have seeds and fruit that are available to countless wildlife species, everything from songbirds to grizzly bears, and really important for humans as well. And you can see on this bee in this picture, on the hind leg, the long hairs on the hind leg are where the pollen is attaching, and it's how it's moving pollen from one flower to the next. So about 2/3 of our world's crop species depend on insects for pollination, and that accounts for about 35% of all of the food and the beverages we consume. In the United States alone, we have more than 100 crop plants that either need or benefit from pollinator insects. And this accounts for about $18 to $27 billion in the value of those crops in the US alone. In addition, really many of our necessary vitamins and the minerals that we need as humans come from plants that are insect pollinated. I really like this illustration of a produce department and what it looks like because of bees, and particularly honeybees in this case, where honeybees are used to pollinate crops. But you can see the diversity of fruits and vegetables and nuts that are available to us because of the services that bees provide. Can you move to the next slide, Sarah?
Yeah, sorry, for some reason it wasn't moving. There we go.
Okay, so in contrast, this is what our produce department would look like if we didn't have bees. So you can see a lot of the variety of fruits and vegetables are gone. You can see that there's still oranges available. Looks like some rhubarb and asparagus, but a lot of our leafy vegetables are missing. So really what we have available are the plants that are going to be wind pollinated that would be available for us to consume if we didn't have pollinators. So it's not just honeybees that are important for pollination. North America is the home to approximately 4,000 species of native bees. We don't really know the exact number of native bees in Montana, but we think that it's in the hundreds of species of bees, and we know we have at least 28 different species of bumblebees in Montana, and all of those are important for pollination. And they contribute about $3 billion a year to the US economy in the pollinator services that they provide. Unfortunately, there's a decline in pollinators, particularly honeybees in managed hives, but also in native pollinators throughout the United States. There's been a 50% decline in the number of managed hives since 1950. And beekeepers are experiencing a 22% to 45% annual loss since 2006. At the same time, we continue to double the amount of cropland that requires bee pollination. As I mentioned, the honeybee loss is only a small part of a much larger problem, and about a quarter of our native bumblebees are also at risk of extinction. So what's causing all of this? Well, it's disease, it's pests that are spreading with the insects. There's pesticide exposure that directly kills or injures the pollinators. And then there's also the loss of habitat. And you can see that on this bee, there's a varroa mite attached to the back of it, which acts like a parasite. So the US is experiencing large-scale loss of pollinator habitat, and there's been an estimated 9 million acres of grassland that have been converted to cropland just since 2008. So this is some of the largest conversion of habitat to cropland that we've really experienced since before the Dust Bowl. Habitat loss also includes the loss of land for development. Excuse me. So with development comes land disturbance, increased herbicide and pesticide use. There's a loss of just floral diversity, which can lead to decline in pollinator populations. And this is an image of West Bozeman. So if you've been here for a while, you've seen the rapid loss in habitat due to development over the last couple decades. I'm going to put myself on mute for just a second. I just need to clear my throat. Okay, excuse me. But I do want to mention that even though we're seeing a decline in habitat, we still have hope, even in our native and urban landscapes, to enhance and create pollinator habitat. In fact, on the top of the New Element Hotel in downtown Bozeman, there's honeybee hives. And all the landscaping plants and ornamental plants we use can also provide a good floral resource for native bees and honeybees. So let's switch now and start talking more about how we create and enhance pollinator habitat. And really there's three main basic habitat requirements that we want to address when doing this. First of all, we want to make sure we have a diversity of plant species. We want to make sure we select an appropriate site, and we also want to maintain a pesticide-free environment. So having a diversity of plants is really important. You want to make sure you have the foraging resources that are going to be available throughout the bloom periods for the whole growing season. So you want to have a diversity of plants, so you make sure that if plants are in flower in the early season, which would be April to June, through the middle of the growing season, which would be July through August, and then into the late summer, all the way until we have a frost. And we also want to make sure we have some diversity of plants for nesting material for the insects. As we increase pollinators and pollinator plants, we also see a lot of benefit to different plant communities. And one of those benefits is that we increase production. So as we increase pollination, as we increase plant diversity, a site generally becomes more productive and produces more biomass. As we increase different diversity of pollinator plants, we can also increase the insects that are present on a site. It's really important for natural and reducing the amount of pesticides we're using on the site. Increased pollinator plants can also help protect the water and soil quality, because they're going to provide more soil cover and stabilize the soil from wind and water erosion and protect other resources. And just generally increasing the pollinator habitat really helps enhance aesthetics of the site, because I think most of us like seeing a blooming landscape. Okay, one of the things we need to think about when we establish our pollinator habitat is, where should we put it? In general, bees are going to be more efficient at foraging and reproducing if they have a shorter distance to fly from the flowering plants to places that they're nesting or overwintering. And places that they're nesting might be hollow plants, holes or that they bore in live or dead wood. They nest in bunch grasses or soil and leaf litter, and also in bare ground. So we want to make sure that it's a short distance or relatively short distance from the nesting habitat to the forage habitat, and realize that most of our native bees, the larger bees, will forage about a mile from their nesting site, while some of the small and medium-sized bees will only travel about 200 to 500 yards. We also want to make sure we pick a site that has a lot of sun exposure, because pollinators need to see the sky to navigate. So pick a site that has open canopy cover and really few trees in the area. The size and shape of our pollinator planting can also be important consideration. If you're going to be putting in a large scale pollinator planting, it's generally better to have a round or a large area where you minimize your edge habitat. And that's important because you're going to be minimizing the amount of weed encroachment you might have from the edge, or any sort of pesticide drift that might happen. Although we realize that, a lot of times having a linear planting is just more practical. And I would say some pollinator habitat is always better than no pollinator habitat. So what you can make room for is a great addition. For smaller plantings, if you only have room for a small planting, that's great. We still recommend having a round shape, because you're going to have less edge effect and more protection from weed encroachment. And just make sure you place it near other pollinating plants in your landscape. And realize that we have a lot of plants in our landscaping already that are great resources for insects. I kind of liked this photo because it's my cat, and this sedum in my landscape must have smelled really attractive to not just her, but you can see there's about 7 different honeybees on it at the same time. So some plants that I see in landscapings that have attract a lot of different honeybees, bumblebees, native bees, pollinating moths, are the sedums, catnip, lots of different varieties of asters or primrose, our native bee balm, Russian sage, blazing stars, penstemons, thyme. They're all great attractors for pollinators and pollinator resources. And don't forget that our shrubby species in our landscape are also great sources for pollinators. Some species that I could think of are the spireas, our chokecherries, our fruit trees, and linden trees are really great resource for pollinator insects. And then also make sure to have some bunch grasses or different structure in your landscape for nesting material for pollinator insects as well. So when we pick a site for a pollinator habitat, remember that roughly 70% of native bees are going to be nesting underground. And their nests are going to resemble an ant nest from above ground. So you might just see a structure like on the lower right. And these nests are going to go down quite a bit into the soil where they have nest chambers. So the other 30% of our native bees are really tunnel nesting bees, and they're going to nest in hollow stems or beetle bore holes, and a lot of times in stumps or dead trees or pithy stem plants. They might also seal their nest entrance with mud or leaves. And if you're like me, I like had this practice of wanting to clean up my landscape as it's going through the blooming season, and I would remove sort of the dead and senesced material. And it took a while to break that habit and really realize that it's really important to keep those structures there for our pollinator species and look at it as a way to add diversity and structure to our landscaping. And then we can also certainly introduce nest boxes and different nesting structures for pollinators to our landscape as well. So just a couple best management practices for our pollinator habitat. We suggest you leave at least half of the habitat undisturbed until after the first frost to make sure there's different floral resources available. Try to avoid cutting it or grazing it while the flowering plants are in bloom. But if you do have to mow it or hay it, do it at reduced speeds, and this helps allow the pollinators to fly out of the area before they can be harmed. Use a higher cut height to leave some of the resources there for the insects, and always allow adequate time for the habitat to recover after you've done some sort of management. So the third part of the habitat is to make sure that we have a pesticide-free environment, because pesticides can directly kill pollinators, but they can also impair their ability to reproduce, and they can compromise their mobility. And indirectly, herbicides might reduce the amount of flowering plants that are available, or it can contaminate the pollen, the nectar, the nesting material, or the water that the pollinators are using as a resource. So we need to really be sure we're protecting the pollinators when we're doing our management. And these are just a few take-home best management practices for maintaining pesticide-free environment. One is that when possible, manage our weeds by clipping them or spot spraying or mowing them or hand pulling them instead of doing a broadcast herbicide application. Make sure we're maintaining a buffer between areas that are treated and our pollinator habitat and our hives, so we're not directly impacting the insects. And also, if we are applying any sort of herbicide or lawn treatment, make sure we apply it at a time when fewer pollinators are active or after the bloom period. So pollinators are going to be less active in the cool parts of the day, the early morning and the late evening. You can also make sure you're using products that have a low toxicity rating for bees, and do what you can to make sure you're avoiding any sort of pesticide drift, and definitely turn it off when you're getting near water resources.
All right, great. So thank you, Monica.
Yeah.
So now we're just going to dive into some more details for how the Gallatin Pollinator Initiative runs and what you can expect as a participant in the program. So with the help of Monica and the Bridger Plant Material Center, we created 2 pollinator seed mixes that landowners can choose from. And we've got the lists of both right up here. The first is our native pollinator mix right here at the top. These species included are native to southwestern Montana. And the second mix we have is called our Conservation Pollinator Mix at the bottom, which is mostly made up of plant species that aren't necessarily native to southwestern Montana, but they still provide beneficial pollinator habitat without becoming noxious. And I'll discuss why we made this mix here in just a second. Included in both seed mixes to help provide nesting materials is grass species. So we have those to provide nesting materials and to provide cover for pollinators. Grasses also can help keep weeds at bay because they fill in any spots where pollinator flowers aren't growing. The grass is already mixed into the conservation mix, but we did keep the grass separate in the native mix. So if you choose that mix, you could choose to mix it into the mix yourself. You could plant it in alternating rows. You can create a border, or you don't necessarily have to use it. So here's some photos of what our native pollinator mix is. So it does have quite a bit of yellow. We've got a few different colors there. And then on the bottom here is our Indian rice grass, which is included with our native mix. And then here are all the flowers included in our conservation pollinator mix. This one does have 2 different types of wheatgrasses included, and these are already mixed into the mix. So which seed is the best one for you to choose? It kind of depends on your site conditions. So both create beneficial habitat, both include flowers that have multiple colors, multiple bloom times, and both include drought-tolerant species, which means less watering maintenance over time. Really, the main difference between the 2 is their ability to compete against weeds. So to circle back, the main reason why we created our conservation pollinator mix is because these plant species have the ability to compete against noxious weeds a lot better than the native mix does. The grass does help keep weeds at bay, but if your property has some major issues with noxious weeds, then we might suggest you use the conservation mix so that you can still provide beneficial habitat and your plot has a better chance of surviving against those weeds over time with potentially less maintenance on your end. So Monica, a question for you actually. I've received questions from landowners about potential issues from pests such as deer, grasshoppers, and geese. Can you speak to which mix might withstand pest damage better? Because that may help folks determine which mix is also best for their property.
Okay, so the native mix we put together, a lot of those are considered deer-resistant plants. So they're not necessarily attractant plants for deer. I'm thinking of the blanket flower, prairie cone flower. You don't usually see them grazed as much, or just a real preference food. There is a species in there, the small burnet is a real ice cream plant for wildlife and livestock, but it's just a small proportion of the mix. So generally the native mix is going to be pretty resistant to deer. The conservation mix has a lot of our forage species in it that are really palatable. So they might be attractive to deer, and I mean, they're definitely attractive to the livestock we're using. They have high nutritional value, but I wouldn't be afraid to plant it in an area where you have deer because they're going to establish really quickly. And they're often much more robust plants than some of our native species. So if you're seeing some deer grazing on them, I wouldn't be as concerned. It would just be making sure they get up and established before you get a whole lot of grazing on them. So make sure that they get to be more of a mature plant before deer are in the area. And there's ways that you can try to deter deer from an area too. They've used sprinklers to do that. You can put a hot wire tape around your planting for the first year or two, but just try to, discourage the deer from entering the site.
Great, thanks, Monica. So the seed we have available, so our seed comes packaged in 100, 500, and 1,500 square foot packs, as you can see in the photo here. But you can request anywhere between 100 square feet worth of seed all the way up to 2,500 square foot of feed. Something to keep in mind is that we did design our native mix to be sufficient without the grass. So if you choose to use the Indian rice grass and want to mix it into your plot or plant it next to your plot, the seed will actually add about 20% more square footage to your space. So if you get a 100 square foot pack of native seed and you also get the Indian rice grass, you'll actually have enough seed to cover about 120 square feet. So in addition to the actual physical seed mix, when you request your seed, you'll also get a list of the species. So you can have a list of the names, their bloom times they're expected, the colors, and some information there. And you'll also be given a planting guide. So this planting guide provides step-by-step instructions for how to prep your chosen pollinator plot site and how to manage over time. We also will provide do-it-yourself monitoring sheets for landowners to identify what is growing in their plot. But before I get into that, I'll hand the floor back over to Monica to first go over a few steps for actually prepping your site, managing your weeds, planting your seeds, and long-term maintenance. All of this information, which is also laid out in the planting guide that we provide.
Okay, thanks, Sarah. I would say that the most important step in developing a pollinator planting is to make sure you have really good site preparation. So decreasing the amount of weeds you have on the site, preparing the soil is really critical to having success. A couple ways that you can prep the site and remove any of the existing vegetation. You can use a combination of chemicals plus tillage. And mostly what I'm talking about here is just using Roundup. So Roundup doesn't have any activity in the soil. It's not going to have any residual. And you can treat it to growing plants and allow them to die back, maybe do that a couple times until the site, to prepare the site. But if you don't want to use chemical, which is totally an option, you might want to just use a tillage treatment. And if you're going to do that and you're going to mix up the roots, I would suggest raking out all of the live root material that could possibly regenerate on the site. And you might want to just allow it then to regenerate and till it again or rake it again to remove some more of that live vegetation that's going to compete with your seedlings. Another way you can prep the site is to use solarization, so putting a black tarp or black mats over the site. I know that some people have really had good success with this, and I think it's probably more beneficial when you have a short-lived species on the site, so real small seeded weeds, probably annual weeds. If you have, real rhizomatous grasses on the site or a larger seeded weed species like field bindweed, I think it's going to be much harder to get rid of those competitive plants through solarization. So it's just maybe going to take a little bit more work. When you're working up the soil, make sure after you work it up to smooth it out and make sure you don't have a lot of large dirt clods. There's really a fine balance with preparing your site of you want to make sure it's workable and you can get your seed into the soil about a ½ inch deep. You want to make sure it can penetrate the soil with its roots, but you don't want so much air in your soil that it's going to dry out your seedlings as they're developing. So sort of our rule of thumb is after you work the site and you walk across it, you want to make sure your boot sinks no more than a half of an inch into the soil. And if you're really going down further than that, then you might just want to do a little compaction, a little rolling of the site, just even light walking over the site to firm it up a little bit before you plant. And then as your seedlings are developing, we want to make sure to try to maintain a weed-free bed. And this can be done by a lot of times on the edge of my weed or the edge of my planting, I might have grasses or weeds encroaching from the side. So I might just mow those on the edge of my planting. I also do a bunch of hand pulling and weeding. And then sometimes if you have a real persistent weed in the area, like you have some Canada thistle or something that just keeps coming into the site and you know it has a really deep root system, you can do a little bit of spot spraying just to make sure you don't get that herbicide, which again, mostly I'm talking about Roundup here. Don't get it on another plant because you will affect those other plants, but you can just do a real light spot application targeting individual weeds. So we get questions on when is the best time to plant, spring or fall. And both of these seed mixes have been designed so you can really plant in either the late fall or the early spring. None of the species are going to require an overwinter dormant period like some of our native forbs do. So these can be planted either time, and it's going to really just depend on when you can get your site prepped and make sure that you have it adequately prepped before you plant. And I want to make sure you understand what we're talking about with fall dormant seeding. So we're talking October 15th or afterwards. So before the ground is frozen, but we want to put that seed in the ground and then just let it overwinter as a seed. We don't want it to try to germinate. We want it to sit there and acquire moisture throughout the wintertime. And then in the spring, when the soil's nice and moist and the soils start to warm up, that's when it's going to germinate and grow. An alternative would be to plant it in the early spring. And by that, I mean sometime in April or early May, all the way up to about May 15th. And we don't really recommend planting after May 15th if you don't have irrigation that you can put on the site. And the reason is that we just want those seedlings to get established and have enough moisture in the soil to get growing and put their roots down while it's still moist and the temperatures are relatively cool. So both these seed mixes can be developed or seeded without any sort of irrigation on the site. But if you do have irrigation available, it's always going to help your planting get established, particularly in the first couple months. But it's not necessarily necessary. You can see in this picture at the bottom, this is a pollinator planting, and we included Black-Eyed Susan in the site, and it's one of the best examples of Black-Eyed Susan establishment I've seen because they were able to flood irrigate the site. There are a lot of other species in this seeding, but you just can't see them at the time of year that we took this photo. But irrigation also, if you have the ability to irrigate during the summer months, it's always just going to be beneficial to your pollinator plants.
Great, thanks again, Monica. So one requirement that we have for those receiving seed through our program is that we would really like folks to monitor their sites, at least in the first 2 years. This is a brand new program for us, and we'd love to be able to get more information for how our plots are growing, what kind of conditions they're growing in, and if there are any species that maybe aren't doing as well in our plots, so then in the future, we could make changes if needed. So we have some monitoring documentation, just a very simple DIY monitoring sheet, and it's shown here at the bottom. All we want to know is if the plant is growing or not. So you can see in the image on the slide that we provide the name of the flower, the picture of the flower itself, and a picture of what the leaves look like, and then just a checkbox for if the flower is present or not. This also helps us learn what's growing during which time of year. And in addition to the monitoring sheets, we would greatly appreciate photos of your plot. So photos of the site before you prepped it, after you prepped it, and of the growing plot. So once a landowner signs up for the program to receive pollinator seed, I'll add your given email to an email list, and we'll send out these monitoring sheets and requests for photos up to 3 times a year. So you don't necessarily have to remember to do it on your own. We will send prompts just to say, hey, can we get some monitoring information or a few photos to see how your plot is doing? Of course, if you're interested, we would love to accept photos and monitoring sheets for really as long as you'd like to give them. Your plot also may be chosen or recommended for some more in-depth monitoring, which would be done by Gallatin Conservation staff. We'll contact you ahead of time to request access to your plot for further monitoring if we'd like to get a little bit more information about your site. All right, so since we just started the Pollinator Initiative this last fall, we don't have any photos of growing plots yet back here in Gallatin County, but we do have some examples of prepared plots for some landowners who did start this fall. So as you can see, there is a variety of locations, shapes, and sizes. And throughout the presentation today, you received a number of tips for best ways to choose and prepare your sites for pollinator habitat. But we're really open to working with everyone, and we realize that sometimes, like Monica said, linear plots are easiest and work best on your property. Ultimately, the more native and conservation pollinator species we get on the landscape, the better. Here I have a few examples of flowering plots that were started by the Pollinator Initiative up in Lake County with the Lake County Conservation District. So on the left, you can see we have a more traditional pollinator strip filled with flowering plants. And then on the right, you can see we have an example of garden boxes filled with pollinator mix that I believe was made by a brewery. So if you have raised beds or garden boxes you'd like to fill, we're open to that as well. All right, so finally, how can you get started with the Gallatin Pollinator Initiative? All you have to do to get the process going is head to our website. The link is here up at the top, and download a cooperator interest form, so shown here on the right side. This form just asks some basic information and a few questions about your current conditions, which makes you interested, and a few yes/no questions. The form on our website is a fillable PDF, so you can just fill it out on the computer, save it, and email it straight to me, where my email is located here as well. You could also print it out and you can mail it to us, or even just drop it off at our office here in Manhattan. So once I have your form, I'll give you a call to discuss some final site prep recommendations and set up a time for you to pick up your seed. If you need any additional help identifying a good spot in your property for your plot, site visits are available. So just let me know when I give you a call and we can set that up. In order to reduce the number of people coming into our office over the next few weeks, we will be holding a few seed pickup days outside in our Education and Outreach Center garden space here in Manhattan. The next seed pickup day will be held on Friday, March 26th from 3 to 5 p.m. And I will provide you with more information on how to get here once I receive your cooperator interest form. If you can't make a designated seed pickup time, then we can identify another time for you to stop by the office. We do also have seeds stored with our partners, the Gallatin Watershed Council, whose office is located in downtown Bozeman. So if you're unable to make it out to Manhattan, I can connect you with Brooke Hellstrom of the Gallatin Watershed Council to identify a time for you to pick up seed there. But I also don't want to overwhelm their office, so we would like to see as many people as possible stopping by Manhattan to pick up your seed. All right, so with that, we'll get on to some questions. I did see we have a few comments, questions written, so let's go through those first, and then we can take raised hand questions afterwards. So let's see, first question from Timothy. Is there a list of plants that are safe for horses and other farm animals, or should a pollinator garden be blocked off? Monica, would you like to maybe, I think we alluded to this a little bit in the presentation.
Yeah, I was just trying to think through the different conservation plants that we have in there, and most of them, they should all be appropriate for grazing with horses. We want to make sure they get established first before any grazing happens. And basically, any plant can have toxicity to it. It just really depends on the dose and the timing. NRCS has recently put together a publication on toxicity of plants to livestock. And if you're interested, it's on the NRCS website for download. But again, it really just depends on the dose and the timing. But most of these plants, or all of them, are really considered good forage species for livestock. So it shouldn't really be an issue.
Great. And I can also get that publication from Monica and post it to our website and information as well for anyone who's interested. All right, next question from Kathy. So she says, I have about an acre that could be seeded. I've been controlling weeds by spot spraying and pulling for 20+ years. The grass is a brome pasture mix and is pretty thick. Do you seed the mixes into an already grassed pasture? Oops, I'm sorry. I just realized you just answered that after. So I'll just, I guess, answer really quick. I would have a crazy weed issue so I think we would suggest mostly to try and clear up as much as possible. Monica, is it possible to still seed this mix into an area where there's grass already, or would you suggest trying to get as much out as possible?
I would suggest getting as much out as possible. What she's talking about is called interseeding, and it can be successful, but I would say the likelihood of it being successful is really low, because those grasses, especially brome grass, is incredibly competitive. And so the more of that you can remove from the site, the better chance you're going to have and success of getting your seeded species established.
Great, thank you. Let's see, another question. So someone's moving out to Whitehall in May. Are you able to still participate in the Pollinator Initiative? Well, the one good thing about our program is that not only did we start our program here in Gallatin County, but we actually did a Southwestern Montana wide initiative with the majority of conservation districts in Southwestern Montana. So many of the surrounding conservation districts in the counties also have a very similar pollinator initiative. So Whitehall, I believe, is over in Madison County. So the right? I'm sorry, I'm a little new to the area still. So, but the Madison Conservation District also has the same program, and you can reach out to them to get seed as well. So I would suggest reaching out to them, and we can provide some information to you, Timothy, if you'd like. All right. So David Carlson made a comment. He recommends the book Attracting Native Pollinators by the Xerces Society. This seems focused on new, larger scale. I have a fenced half-acre trying to favor native bees. Any interest in legacy site? A lot of this information you received today is kind of a lot for larger scale, but a lot of this is also very useful for smaller scale. So we are open to providing seed for anyone through half-acre, small sizes, all the way up to 2,500. So as you saw in some of the photos, we can really accommodate any small size landowners. I guess, David, if you're on, can you explain a little bit more any interest in legacy site and what you mean by that?
If David's not on, I'll just mention that the book he's talking about from Xerces Society, Attracting Native Pollinators, I don't know if that book in particular is available on their website. I think you could purchase it, but they have many, many resources for pollinators that are available for free for download on their website. So I can get you those resources as well, Sarah, and you can post those to your website for everyone.
This is also a good opportunity to mention that we did just add some more information to our website underneath the additional resources tab on the main menu, and it provides some additional information for pollinators, for landowners living by the bank and noxious weeds. And in the pollinator webpage, we do try to provide some other information from other sites, just like the Xerces Society and some other places. So it might be a good spot for you guys to check out some other information. All right, next question from Carol. So her question is, I bought a small boar bee house last fall. Where would be the best place to mount it, and by when should it be up? Monica, could you answer that one?
Okay, I'm not an entomologist. I'll just mention that, but I think that a lot of those bee houses have a recommendation for the height they should be above the ground. So look at that. And I think a lot of them should be placed in the sun. I think there's just some general recommendations on them for, you know, direction to prevailing wind and height above the ground. And then definitely, like we were talking about, the closer you can have it to both the foraging resources and where they're gonna, so then they're nesting in the same site. I think that if you can include it in the same area, that would be really great. But again, I'm just going to point out that the Xerces Society on their website, they have a lot of information on how to build some of these pollinator boxes and houses. And so I think they're going to have information with those on the placement. So definitely check those out.
Great. And we can also look up some more of that information as well. I've got the question noted. So a question from Jennifer Mulder, with all in the native, will the plants in the native mix do well with flood irrigation or just black-eyed Susan?
Yeah, a lot of them will do well. And it was really hard to see in that photo because the black-eyed Susan really predominated, but that mix also had prairie cone flower and Indian blanket flower, Lewis flax in it, and then it had a bunch of other species. It was in Wyoming, so there were other native forbs, and they all came in really well. The only species that didn't come in as well in that mix were some annual species we had in the mix, but we don't have any annual species in the mix we put together. So yeah, I think they'll all do great with a little flood irrigation.
All right, next question, Becky Peters. How do I get this program started in Ravalli County? Well, I would start with contacting your local conservation district. I know a lot of conservation districts in northwestern Montana are already starting their own programs as well. And if they haven't, then I would suggest it to them because we have some really great people within the conservation district system who have a lot of resources to get this program going. And the conservation districts really would be a great place to start with getting these programs started in your county. All right, another question, does Yellowstone County also have this initiative? At the moment, I don't think Yellowstone County does. Again, though, if you would like to reach out to your local conservation district in Yellowstone County, they would be probably one of the best ones to get this going. Another question is, do you provide a field guide to the native pollinators so we can identify what we are attracting? We do provide a seed mix list, which shows the photos and the names of the plants. And we can provide additional information for sure, so you know what you're know what flowers you're planting, and we can also look into which native pollinators so you can identify that you're attracting. So that is something that we'll look into providing some more information on what the actual native pollinators are. We do have some new signage that will be going up in our Education and Outreach Center here in Manhattan, which does identify a few native pollinators. So if you ever have a chance to stop by our gardens, we have some pollinator gardens, raised beds, and a few other demonstration gardens. It'd be great just to stop by and take a look and see what we have. That signage will be hopefully put up sometime this spring. Okay, let's see. We had a question. David Carlson, are you still on the call today? Yes. Okay. So I see you have your question of not new broadcast planting, but existing site management. And then you had followed up with e.g. what plants do we have or can we use to get 3 blossoming in 3 seasons? So I'll just mention that the seed mixes that we provide, they do have plants that already bloom throughout all 3 seasons. And you can also add other plants as well. Do you want to, could you potentially specify a little bit more what your question is asking? You could either unmute yourself or type it in.
Okay, thanks.
Perfect.
I live on an existing spot, good for bees, I think, but I don't want to do new plantings. I have gardens and lawn and grass. So how do I manage an existing site? If I'm not going to use your seed mix, but I have plenty of options, what are the tools? What are the plants? Should I just use this book? How do I contribute?
So you said you already have some plants already established in your property?
I have asters, I have Maximilian sunflowers. Bees love oregano, they love tomatillas.
All right.
How do we share this information? How do we be part of a larger effort to improve pollinators?
Well, it already sounds like you're doing your part. You've got some flowers going and they're already enjoying it. Really, if in the information we provided here, you can probably just take the tips we have for maintenance. So, you know, making sure you aren't having weeds encroach in those areas, you know, making sure you're not using pesticides near them. And it already sounds like you're doing a great job of including pollinators. So you may not have to do much extra if you're not planning to add seed from our area. But if you have any other questions, you can always maybe send us some questions and we can follow up with some more information if you need. So thank you, David. All right, a couple other questions come up. So from Connor, what do you recommend for seeding methods? Is hand casting sufficient, or do you recommend renting, borrowing a broadcast seeder or some other equipment? My initial answer to that is it really depends on how big your site is. So if you're doing just a 100 square foot little plot, you know, just hand casting is perfect for that. If you're doing a larger site and you are able to rent or borrow some broadcast seeder equipment, that might be more easier. It really depends on what you have available to you and how big of a site you have. Does that help, Connor? But broadcast seed, this mix is specifically made to be broadcast seeded, not necessarily drill seeded. Ooh, so another question from Carol. Have you thought of providing a sign for pollinator plots indicating what they are to generate more interest by passerbys? Something like seed provided by GCD to protect bees, more info to this website. And we actually have, so we actually have some little signs. Let me see if I can show. That would have been a good idea to have maybe like a little sign or a little flow code that someone could pass by. But you can, I don't know if you can see in this photo in the garden box, Lake County Conservation District has this little sign with a sticker that shows, has the Pollinator Initiative logo. And we do have quite a few of those printed up. So if you have a plot that is in a bit more of a public area and you would like to put a little sign in there that kind of shows where the seed is coming from, we would gladly hand these out to folks. And so folks can see kind of where these seeds are coming from and where the plot comes from. So yes, definitely, Carol. All right. So that's all the questions on the chat. Is there anyone else who has any questions that they would like to say aloud? And if you do, if you can maybe use your raise your hand feature. Or Lorca, do you have a question?
Yeah, I just tapped it in, but I was just thinking that for people like David or other people in the community who you know who are already have really mature plots, that's the kind of thing I'd love to see what it can look like when it's done, right? For those of us who are starting out, consciously focusing in on this. And I think it would be really, I mean, it's just a great teaching tool for you all to be able to share with people, because it can look so many different ways, right? A healthy one. So it
Definitely.
really expands the options.
Yeah, no, so that's great. That's a great idea. So any photos, and David, I see your comment in the chat box. If you want to share any photos, you could always, tag us on Facebook, or you could just email me directly. You could send photos. So my email is sarah@gallatincd.org. You can find that on our website. So all you have to do is just share those photos with me, email, and we could share those just to show examples of pollinator plots that are doing great in the county already. So thank you, Lorca. That's a good point. All right, we got about 4 more minutes. Any other questions at all? Okay, I'm not seeing any. So with that, I just want to say thank you all for attending today. Feel free to contact me with any other questions, and we are really hoping to, I'm hoping to see some more cooperator interest forms. So just make sure to sign into our website, gallatincd.org, and go to the Gallatin Pollinator Initiative under Programs and Services and download that form. It also provides other information. You can see the planting guide there and the planting list. But once we get those cooperator interest forms, we will be able to get started. So thank you guys so much, and have a great rest of your day. And spread the word, yes. And this will be recorded and put up on our website, so you can refer back to it at any time. All right, thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thanks, Sarah.